In Greensborro, North Carolina at 4:30 on Monday, February 1st. 4 teenagers, dressed well, entered the Woolworth Diner after buying toothpaste, notebooks, and pencils. They showed their receipts and stayed on despite Clarence Harris, the manager, who ran over and told them they do not belong there. Whites in the restaurant were appalled and got up and left while yelling obscenities. But they quietly sat there on the stools at the Formica countertops at the L-shaped counter waiting to be served. This was Joseph McNeil, David Richmond, Air Force ROTC Franklin McLean, and Elizal Bear Jr., who were 4 students at North Carolina A&T College in Greensboro, decided in early 1960 to challenge the demeaning, hypocritical policy of Woolworth department store, where blacks could buy goods but had to eat in a stand-up snack bar in the back and would be refused service at the sit-down diner. So they decided, after reading black protest literature in college, a lot of the writers from the Harlem Renaissance, they went to a presentation by the Little Rock Nine and heard MLK Jr. decide to protest and heard MLK Jr.'s speech. They were inspired by these, trained by these people, and decided to then protest this policy through the sit-in movement. And so the next day, 31 black men and women returned with them. By Saturday, 90% of the A&T students, both at the black and women college, with white college students as well, filled up all 66 seats of the Woolworth Diner and moved to other department stores throughout Greensboro, and continued to then expand to other businesses. And this then began kind of a on-fire movement that spread everywhere. And so you see here that all the students lined up in Greensboro. So to look at why did this movement go? So at first it spread to Raleigh, Durham, High Point, Winston-Salem, and all across North Carolina. Black colleges and churches started getting together and creating training places. Freud McKissick, the first black admitted to law school in the University of North Carolina, created a sit-in headquarters where they provided training. Ella Baker, the SCLC executive director, heard about the sit-ins and challenged students at Southern colleges to act. And students in places outside of the South began to act. White students at Michigan, Swarthmore, Berkeley, Harvard picketed Woolworth stores to express their support. And you can see that right here in this video, or in that picture. So historian William Chafe called it the Greensboro Coffee Party, and he said it's a watershed moment in U.S. history. The volcanic event comparable to the Boston Tea Party before the Revolution. The civil rights movement had lost momentum, and the sit-ins revived it. And so with her challenge came the sit-ins all over the United States. White university students picketed the Woolworth store. And students aimed for full desegregation, because it wasn't long that in North Carolina they offered to go ahead and make it work, to say, hey, we will split the lunch counter to black, half white. And the students refused. So in Nashville, James Lawson was a divinity student at Vanderbilt University. And 2 friends of his along with himself, provided students in Nashville, Tennessee with weekly nonviolent workshops so that they would be ready to begin to take the sit-in movement to Nashville. And one of the reasons we're talking about Nashville is this becomes one of the largest movements in the sit-ins. This was the largest sit-in movement. And so, largest sit-in movement in Nashville. One of the parts of the Diane Fisk said in the training, you have to do more than just not hit back. You have to love those that hit you. So it was, this nonviolent movement was beyond just sitting there and stymieing, but to really figure out what it meant to love the other person. Police chief said that students would be arrested, but students were committed to the nonviolent approach. And as you can see here, this is what would happen. The students would be abused by whites, then taken out by the police, and often beat on their way to being arrested. And so they harassed black students. Police let them get harassed, then arrested them. But Nashville had 4 waves of students. So after the first group of students would be arrested, then the next group would come in. And at each of the 3 department stores that they went for, they went to Crest, Woolworth, and McClellan, and repeated the idea where they bought goods from the store to give them a right to be there. Then they used the white-only bathroom, sat at the lunch counters, did homework or whatever to spend the time, but stayed there. Nashville blacks spent $50 million annually in downtown businesses, so the sit-ins threatened the income of these stores. The Nashville police chief announced that demonstrators would be arrested. John Lewis, one of the leaders, made a list of do's and don'ts to remind students of the nonviolent approach. They were arrested, as we can see here. And when they were arrested, they did a jail, no bail approach, to the point where the jail was so full that police lowered bail to $5, but they refused to pay, so that they had to just release students, who then refused to go. The mayor offered a compromise, but the students refused, and black community supporters supported the students. They began to feed them before they would go into the department stores or lunch counters. He then also boycotted downtown businesses. As the protest took hold, a bomb destroyed the home of Alexander Luby, one of the students involved. 4,000 students marched to City Hall, where Diane Nash asked Mayor Ben West's opinion on racial discrimination. West agreed as a man that discrimination was morally wrong, and in 3 weeks, Nashville started to desegregate its lunch counters. Of course, the first students served were badly beaten. James Lawson was expelled from Vanderbilt, and it took 4 more years of similar protests before hotels, movie theaters, and fast food restaurants integrated. Sit-ins occurred in every southern state but Mississippi. By the end, 70,000 people crossed the color line in 150 cities. They went beyond lunch counters to include many other types of businesses and public places. Because these protests hurt the bottom line of businesses, states put pressure on black colleges that businesses began to cave. And still, local governments put pressure on black colleges to expel protesters. 200 students were expelled and some faculty fired, and yet 3,600 protesters were jailed in Greensborro. The police would allow white thugs to beat students, and instances blacks being shot on segregated beaches, and other protests continued. In April, Ella Baker called a meeting of student protests, which included many of the influential leaders of the next 12 years of the movement. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. One of the things, though, is that other people started to get involved. MLK in Atlanta went and participated in the sit-in movement and was arrested. One black comedian was arrested, or when he went to the store, he was told by the white waitress, "We don't serve colored people here." He responded, "That's all right. I don't eat colored people. Bring me a whole fried chicken." And so many of the influential leaders, black movie stars, and people began to participate in this movement to give it even more widespread publicity. And a group of a Highlander folk school began workshops teaching students different, what they called freedom songs, to be able to sing in these protests to kind of galvanize them. And this becomes something that shows up in many of the different protests in the next 12 to 15 years of the movement. One of the things to look at is that they were eventually successful because of the boycott along with the sit-ins. When MLK was arrested, though, this brought widespread protests and letters because Kennedy's in the middle of, it's October 19th, and Kennedy is in the middle of the election. And so MLK getting arrested at that point forced the candidates to have to deal with it. And so Kennedy dealt with it by basically putting pressure on the governor and the mayor to release Martin Luther King. He spoke out for segregation, and he won the presidential election because of the black vote. Now, you might wonder why he took so long to act later, but it was the black vote that gave him that election, and many of those were in the North because many blacks in the South weren't allowed to vote. So the sit-ins were effective, along with boycotts of the businesses by more people. Mobilized students to participate in the civil rights movement, and not just black students, but white students as well. And so what you have here is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organizing. Now, they were advised by Ella Baker to stay independent, and they didn't want to fall under the rules of the SCLC and other groups. So they wanted, and Ella Baker challenged them to move into healthcare, jobs, voting, housing, and education, and they did. And it becomes one of the most influential groups in the civil rights movement. Thank you for watching.